The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Helene Geismar-Katz, and I have the privilege of being the director of the Center for Adult Life and Learning here at the 92nd Street Y. We are soon coming to the close of our spring season, but of course we wouldn't want to leave you too hungry for the discourse that you find here. So thus, within a few weeks, you should be receiving our summer program. This year, the format of the summer catalog is very different from what you're used to. It will be incorporated in our newspaper, The Wire Review, which I hope you've received in the mail before. So please look for that. That will be the summer catalog, so don't put it to the side and expect to find something else coming. It is my pleasure to welcome you here to the third and final evening in our series entitled Then and Now, in which speakers who have been with us in the past, all of them around 20 years ago, have returned to update us. Felix Roten and Ralph Nader appeared on the first two evenings of this series that has been part of the commemoration of the 120th anniversary of the 92nd Street Y. And now let me introduce our speaker for this evening. He is a native New Yorker who attended public schools here, then on to the University of Wisconsin, semester of graduate school at LSU. His journalistic career began in 1941 in Washington, but was interrupted by his service in the Navy during World War II. After the war, he worked as a wire service and newspaper reporter and as a news writer for CBS in Washington. But then, in 1949, he moved into his permanent home at NBC, where he stayed for 35 years until his retirement in 1984. During that time, he headed the NBC bureaus in London, in Paris, and Rome, reported from a dozen countries, and anchored every kind of news program possible, as well as some that were not news. After all, he hosted Saturday Night Live twice. Retirement has not been a time of peace and quiet for him, however. He has continued to work in television, anchoring numerous programs on PBS, including the series Congress, We the People. He's continued to write and to lecture, and of course to pursue his interest in the state of the English language. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to hear from the professional's professional. Please join me in welcoming Edwin Newman.
Helene, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. The title of this series is Then and Now, and I think that question of the changes between then, which as Helene said began for me in 1941, and now will be implicit in my remarks as I go along. There are a few things these days, ladies and gentlemen, that are more the topic of discussion, more the cause of concern, than what most people call the media, and what I, out of force of habit that began 54 years ago, call the news business. How do we in the business use or misuse our power? How well do we serve the nation? Are we all sneaky closet liberals? Or worse? Are we fair? Well, let's begin with that. Are news people fair? It's necessary at the outset to understand that what the news is not determined very often by considerations of fairness. Obviously, if you carry an accusation against somebody, you have the plain duty to ask that person to comment. Obviously, you should not edit what people say to make them look bad or make them look good. That will sometimes happen, but you should not try for it. Obviously, you should not allow yourself to be used or manipulated, though that will sometimes happen also, as it did to many news people during the war in the Persian Gulf in 1991. The problems, however, are more complex. In the first place, news is a business, a competitive business. Not only do news organizations and the individuals within those organizations compete with one another, News is itself competitive in the sense that every item is fighting for airtime or space in print with every other item. It is also, in a manner of speaking, an accidental business. What gets heavy play today might not have yesterday because of other things that were happening. It might not tomorrow. What is news at 9 a.m. may be much less big a minute or two later because of other things that are happening. An example of the accidental. In the spring of 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev went to China. The main news organizations were there in force. They were presented with an even larger story, the student demonstrations in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. But note, in Tiananmen Square. The story was concentrated day after day in just that one place. Covering it was greatly simplified. Then the Chinese government forbade further coverage. You had personnel and equipment there. Was it a waste of money? Did you pull them out? How long did you wait before you decided? A further point, if you did keep your teams in Beijing, were you encouraging the students to go on with their demonstrations, perhaps contributing to their risking prison, injury, even death? And if you're a correspondent in Beijing now, do you seek out critics of government policy? Does not that put them at risk, even when they want to be interviewed? Another aspect of the accidental, local, remember the New York subway bombing last December? That took place in Lower Manhattan in the financial district. One of the cable channels, CNBC, concentrates on business news and keeps a staffed mobile unit in Wall Street. So, it was able to cover the aftermath of the explosion before others were. Pure chance. Or take the siege and eventual destruction of the Branch Davidian compound outside Waco, Texas, year before last. A tremendous story, dramatic, emotional, dreadful too, with the children inside and the others who became victims. But remember, it went on for weeks with nothing happening, and with access for reporters and camera crews strictly limited by the authorities. Now, especially with the camera crews, do you leave them there for the same distant pictures day after day? You knew there had to be a climax, but how long do you wait? And as you wait, do you allow a little impatience, a little implicit criticism of the FBI to creep into your reports? The same questions crop up over and over again. Chechnya's war with Russia has to be covered, of course, and the civil war in what used to be Yugoslavia. But how many of your resources and how much of your airtime and space in print do you devote to them? And are you prepared to put at risk the lives of those you send to cover the wars or to cover the famine and turmoil in Somalia? Journalists were killed there too. In fact, in the fall of '93, American news organizations pulled their employees who were United States citizens out of Somalia for fear they might be taken hostage. Reuters, the BBC, Agence France-Presse, the Toronto Star, and some others kept their people on. Now, sometimes you're in a country where United States policy is disliked. That can put you in danger or get you thrown out. For that matter, sometimes you cannot get in. Algeria, for example, grants very few visas to foreign reporters and also severely limits what Algerian news organizations can report. Still, in 1994 alone, one French journalist and 26 Algerian journalists were killed by the Islamic opposition to the government. Then there was Rwanda, and of course Haiti. Now, I've worked in Haiti, and I'm not sure that I would want to go back now, or to Algeria, where I worked in the late 50s and early 60s. For that matter, in our own country, in Los Angeles, the police department recently put out some advice to news organizations on how to protect their people in certain areas. Do not use vehicles with station logos on them. Assign one crew member to guard against the stealing of equipment. If you wear body armor, be sure it has side panels, and be careful to conceal it. Imagine that, news people wearing body armor. But to get back to Haiti, when United States forces went in there last September, CNN held off reporting the departure of American aircraft because showing it would have enabled the military rulers then in power in Haiti to calculate when they would arrive and perhaps take some measures against them. And when CNN showed the planes landing, it tried not to show any landmarks that would have helped the Haitian military recognize the landing areas. CNN did these things at the request of the Department of Defense and came under some criticism in the business for doing so, but it chose the course that would not endanger American lives. Then we had the Cuba story and the new wave of refugees. Every time you ran pictures of Cubans in their small and rickety boats trying to get across the Florida Strait, you conceivably aroused sympathy for them. Should that have affected your news judgment? And did you bring up the history of our relations with Cuba, including President Kennedy's Bay of Pigs disaster in April of '61? Now go back to early '91, when Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and our response to it very nearly monopolized the news. The competition was tremendous, and millions upon millions of dollars were poured out. At times, there may have been too much of this, but how and when do you go back to normal programming when a war has begun? If you're ABC, CBS, or NBC, do you try to meet CNN on its own ground? How many war specials do you put on when 80% of the commercial time goes unsold? NBC alone estimated that the cost of covering the war and of lost commercials came to $45 million. What is more, even before Iraq went into Kuwait, network news departments were undergoing heavy cost cutting. Now they're relying on foreign sources of coverage and local sources and pool arrangements more than ever before. Now, in going through all of this, I'm not asking you to feel sorry for people in news. For that matter, the great majority of decisions in news are routine. You barely have to think about them. But there are also decisions made under pressure, and some that divide news people themselves. Take the matter of Bill Clinton and Jennifer Flowers. That started in a checkout counter paper which paid Jennifer Flowers. But can you simply ignore it? Then, soon after the Clintons moved into the White House, there were stories attributed to disgruntled members of the Secret Service about loud arguments between the president and his wife. Please note, not everybody carried these stories. Next, the magazine American Spectator quoted 2 Arkansas state troopers as saying that they had helped arrange meetings between Mr. Clinton and a number of women. I was in New York at that time. The morning after the story broke, the New York Post gave it its entire front page. So did the Daily News. The Times ignored it. The following day, the Times ran a distinctly unsensational Associated Press story about it on page 28. The next day, after Hillary Clinton spoke out, the Times had it on the front page with a picture above the fold. Now, had the Times editors blown it the first couple of days? After which came Paula Jones and her accusation of sexual harassment against Mr. Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas. Now, you're working for what might be called a respectable news organization. How heavily do you play the Paula Jones story? Then there's Whitewater. Even before Whitewater really took off, Mr. Clinton was complaining. In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine in November of '93, he said, "I have fought more damn battles here for more things than any president has in 20 years, with the possible exception of Reagan's first budget, and not gotten one damn bit of credit from the knee-jerk liberal press." Well, maybe his annoyance was understandable. Anybody might get tired of the endless, detailed, minute-by-minute coverage. And it is a fact that political promises not fulfilled are more newsworthy than those that are made good on. So there is a concentration on what has not been done. Also, reporting on politics is less purely descriptive than it used to be and more interpretive. So more criticism, implied or specific, creeps in. Interpretive may in fact be too weak a word. With television looking for drama and the press having to go along, aggressive or adversarial would be more like it. Also, no political act is any longer taken at face value. There is always the search for the hidden motive. Now, and you may have been wondering when I would get to this, the OJ Simpson case. Call it a feeding frenzy, an orgy, an extravaganza, a wallowing in the prurient, a cynical exploitation, yet the public interest undoubtedly is there. And taking it strictly as a news story, consider the pluses. A famous football player, later a TV sports commentator and an actor and a star of commercials. A black husband and a white wife. A wife from a first marriage lying very low. Children alive from both marriages. The locale, one of the richest suburban areas in the country. Some of access for cameras to the courtroom. Some of the best-known lawyers in the country, all of whom know a good deal about dealing with television and the press. And finally, of course, the fact of a double murder. Nothing interests the American people more than a murder mystery. Book sales, movies, and videos demonstrate that. And here is the real thing. And there was that strange drive through Los Angeles with Simpson holding a gun to his head, with police cars in pursuit, and the news blimps and helicopters overhead. Was there ever anything like it before? I doubt it. Even the fact that Simpson is known as OJ helped the story along. Now, has it all been overdone? Perhaps so. Undoubtedly so on the part of many news organizations, especially those we may call the tabloid or checkout counter type, in print and on the air. But it isn't only the coverage of the Simpson case that matters. It's also what that coverage does to other stories, because there are other stories not being reported on, or being reported on more skimpily, thanks to the space in print and the time on the air the Simpson case is getting. And I'll repeat another point. You're in charge of a news operation and you're spending large amounts of money covering the Simpson story. To justify that expenditure, you want to run it high every day. You need a fresh angle, a fresh development. It can be a tough business, and more you take your stories where you find them. So one day, the New York Times used material from the checkout counter tabloid, The National Enquirer, about Simpson's alleged conversation with the Reverend Rosie Greer, and ran into a lot of criticism in various journalistic quarters because it did. But whatever the O.J. Simpson story tells us about the news business, it tells us a good deal more about the American legal system, the delays, the costliness, the tortuousness, the emphasis on technicalities. All of that needs to be looked at. Years and years ago, I tried to get NBC News to do just that. I did not succeed. Well, all of this helps to explain why I speak of news organizations and I do not use the term media. A medium has no choice about what it transmits. We do. That is in good measure what the business is about. A number of years ago, USA Today learned that the tennis player Arthur Ashe had AIDS, which forced him to announce that he did. That led to a debate within the business over whether USA Today had been unfair in pressing him for a statement, whether Ashe was entitled to privacy about his illness. I knew Arthur Ashe, I liked and admired him, but I don't know the answer. In fact, there is no single answer. These things are matters of news judgment and of appraisals of what your viewers and readers want. In that connection, when Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago was accused of child abuse, CNN headline news led with it for hours over 2 days. Was it that compelling a story? Months later, the man who made the accusations against Cardinal Bernardine withdrew them, saying that his recollection of what allegedly had happened 17 years earlier had come when he was under hypnosis and could not be relied on. Now, when charges of this kind are withdrawn, shouldn't that get the same prominence that the charges themselves did? Don't laugh. Now, another basic question underlies all of this: how much coverage is justified? When a man ran up on the stage while former President Reagan was speaking in Las Vegas and smashed a glass statuette and almost injured Mr. Reagan, I happened to read USA Today and the national edition of the New York Times the next morning. USA Today had the story in the center of the front page above the fold. The Times had it on page 8. Much the same thing happened when Frank Sinatra collapsed on stage during a performance in Richmond, Virginia. Entire front page, the New York Post. Entire front page, the Daily News. The Times, 5 short paragraphs on page 6 of the second section. So, how much coverage is called for? You're waiting for the verdict in the second trial of the Los Angeles police officers accused of beating Rodney King. What's your policy? A story a day? Concentrating on police preparations? Looking for Korean shopkeepers with guns? Interviewing young blacks who may say something threatening? When you mention the possibility of violence, do you make violence more likely? But if you're not doing that reporting, are you doing your job? Of course, it can be overdone. Well, behind all of this, as I was saying, is the fact that news is a business. It is a competitive business. And one thing competition may do is lead to incorrect and premature judgments about election results. That is, the competition to rush out with significant-sounding conclusions. This comes about because of the urge to dramatize, to simplify, and this can affect the political life of our country. I thought, for example, that the size of Jimmy Carter's victory in the 1976 New Hampshire primary was exaggerated, to the detriment of other Democratic candidates. I thought that Gerald Ford's early victories in the 1976 primaries were exaggerated by many news organizations, and that Ronald Reagan was written off too soon. In 1980, how many times were Edward Kennedy and George Bush asked when they were going to drop out? Bush never got away from the question. In 1984, Ronald Reagan's alleged invincibility before his first debate with Walter Mondale was exaggerated, and Mondale's victory in that debate was exaggerated, which damaged him by leading to unrealistic expectations about what he would do in the second debate, which, as it happened, I moderated. Well, in the business, we do sometimes squeeze stories to get the most out of them, and then these interpretations may take on a life of their own. We saw something along these lines after the Persian Gulf War, with all the polls showing President Bush with phenomenally high approval ratings and suggesting that the outcome in 1992 was a foregone conclusion. Well, these apparently led some Democrats to stay out of the contest, and they almost certainly misled Mr. Bush into paying little attention to domestic affairs. In short, they may have helped Bill Clinton become president. There was also a burst of stories about possible political futures for General Norman Schwarzkopf and General Colin Powell. Remarkable, since we knew so little about what their political views might be. And if I may say so, how General Schwarzkopf would look in civilian clothes. Now in '95, there's talk again about General Powell, especially among the public opinion pollsters, although we still do not know where he stands politically, while he maintains a characteristically dignified silence. To get back to competition, sometimes when a story gets started and competition sets in, the story takes on a life of its own. This happened in 1992 with the George Bush is trailing in the polls story. There was a competition in showing him behind, even hopelessly behind. I am afraid that this is almost normal journalistic practice. The public should be helped to understand this and to discount some of what it hears. Much the same thing happened after the elections in November '94. This time the competition was in personalizing it, showing it as a disaster for President Clinton. It was no triumph for Mr. Clinton, far from it. but the banging away at the same angle over and over again did become tiresome. And of course, it may affect the political process itself. This phenomenon could be seen over the years with Vice President Dan Quayle, with the competition in showing him to be not very bright. Now, I don't say that he did not contribute to this, but when ideas like that take root, they are very hard to shake. Now, another sort of editorial decision. How do you judge the relative importance of a story? The death and burial of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, for example. Do you lead your program with it? Let it dominate your front page or your cover? Go over the same aspects of her life again and again? Use her death as a way to work in pictures of President Kennedy's assassination? How much space do you give her second marriage, which was looked at pretty cynically at the time it came about? I keep mentioning competition. When Mrs. Onassis died, there was a competition in writing eloquent copy, heartbreaking copy. I don't mean to sound nasty about this, but that is what happened. And when Richard Nixon died, how did you rate his early McCarthyite days and Watergate and his place as the only president who had to resign against other aspects of his career? How much analysis of his extremely unusual personality did you put in? I remember Julie Nixon saying to me one morning on the Today Show that one thing she could not stand was the long-distance psychoanalysis of her father. Still, Richard Nixon was as uncomfortable a public figure as I have ever seen. Would it have been unfair and improper to mention that after he died? Now, yet another kind of editorial decision. John Simpson, who's the foreign affairs editor of the BBC, wrote recently about being in Rwanda and spending, quote, extraordinary amounts of time squinting into the viewfinder of the camera, deciding whether the pictures of bodies were sufficiently wide and inoffensive, and what angle to film the skulls from so that the viewer would not see the holes in them. This was to fit in with BBC rules on the showing of death and violence. On the other hand, Simpson points out, last year in a hospital in Sarajevo, French television news filmed the operation to amputate a child's leg without anesthetic, and most of it was shown. And he goes on, at about the same time I reported from an entirely empty operating theater in Angola, where amputations were also done without anesthetic. We did not film the operations. Nevertheless, in the end, we omitted that part of the report. Even to speak of them was too disturbing. Last January 31st, a car bomb went off in Algiers and killed 40 people and wounded 254. Algerian television showed some of the aftermath, but told its viewers, we have not shown you all the pictures. Some are far too horrible. So, editorial decisions, not always the same. And American television, by the way, tends to show less of the gruesome than the British do, and the British less than television on the continent. John Simpson makes an interesting additional point, that there has been a slow decline in the viewing figures for television news, that watching the news is, as he puts it, no longer quite the social duty it once was. He thinks it may be traceable to what he calls disaster fatigue, of people feeling helpless in the face of all the wars and famines they watch on the news. Now, I'd like to say something now about a request that members of the public often make to people in the news business, and that request is, just give us the facts. Fair enough, but the just give us the facts attitude presupposes that everything is on the up and up, that those in authority are telling the truth, that nothing is being held back, and that reporting consists of little more than repeating what you're told. Now, of course, it does not follow that news people are infallible, that their motives are always selfless, that all reporters, camera crews, editors, and producers are equal in ability and reliability, that large amounts of nonsense are not pumped out. There's office politics, there are nepotism and cronyism, There are bootlickers, there are phonies, there are insanely inflated salaries, and there are egos that have been insanely inflated too. Still, there are standards that most news people try to meet, and the tradition of giving the news straight is still powerful, especially in the wire services, but news is not automatic. Let's say you were covering last year's United States Senate contest in Virginia. How long did you go on mentioning Charles Robb's confession of improper conduct and Oliver North's conviction of lying to Congress? When did they become irrelevant? And that dreadful mistake over the no-fly zone in Iraq, when 2 American fighter pilots shot down 2 American helicopters with the loss of 26 lives, 14 of them American. Did you try to get the pilots' names and other information about them, whether they were being punished, whether their careers were over? Now, these are men whose lives are blighted forever. Was it right to pursue them, or did you simply leave it to the Defense Department to put out what it chose to? This last seems to be what happened. I would hate to give the wrong impression. We are, on the whole, fair. What I've been trying to say is that the problems are not what they're so often made out to be, the products of bias. They would be much easier to deal with if they were. I remember the night President Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election in 1968. He made that announcement in a speech in which he also announced a limit on the bombing of North Vietnam. His purpose, Mr. Johnson said, was peace. And by not standing for re-election, he was showing that he was sincere and not seeking political advantage. Very well. You're on the air. I happen to be. There's Mr. Johnson's decision, which you've just heard about for the first time. Was it fair to point out the results of the New Hampshire primary a week or so earlier, in which Eugene McCarthy, the anti-war candidate, did so well? Was it fair to point to the primaries coming up, which Robert Kennedy had entered? To point out that Mr. Johnson could go almost nowhere in the country without being picketed? How do you decide these things, especially in a hurry and on the spot? Ask yourself, how would you handle certain stories? What would you have done with George Bush's speech during the 1988 campaign, the one in which he got the date of Pearl Harbor wrong by 3 months, when he said that 47 years before, on that very day, September 7th, Japan had attacked us? Now, would you have led with his mistake or with his criticism of Michael Dukakis on defense questions? Suppose you had led with a mistake. Would you have dressed it up with a phrase like, in perhaps the most bizarre incident of the campaign so far, George Bush today? Would you have tried to find out who wrote the speech? Whether Bush had seen it before he delivered it? Would you have consulted medical experts? Would you also then have been accused of being biased against Mr. Bush? Then there was Dukakis' speech at the defense plant near St. Louis, the one about foreign investment in the United States and how far out of hand it was and how dangerous and how he wanted to change all of that. The plant at which he spoke was owned by a company in Luxembourg. Now, do you concentrate on what Dukakis said or on where he said it? Should he have checked on the plant's ownership before he spoke? Was anybody on his staff fired? People say, give us the facts. Which of the facts are news? That is what we decide and have to decide. One of the first things George Bush did when he became president was back away from, virtually abandon, the Reagan policy on Nicaragua. He had said nothing about that during the campaign. Do you point that out? The Bush's dog gives birth. Is that news? No, but it's a nice, pleasant story. It makes people smile, so you carry it. Now, of course, the overwhelming majority of the decisions in news are routine. You barely have to think about them. Those that are not routine, however, are more instructive. Go back to the day in 1981 when President Reagan was shot. One thing you have to decide is how far to permit yourself to comment on the event and whether to stick to the official information. Also, whether to appraise the way those affected are dealing with the situation. You make these decisions independently at first. As things become better organized, it turns into more of a team job. But if you're out front, you cannot escape the responsibility that goes with that, and you will, to a considerable extent, set the tone of your network's coverage. Well, there was criticism of our coverage of the Reagan shooting because we put out some incorrect stories and because we were going along with relatively little information. A couple of points. We had to go on the air. Shots had been fired at the president. Some of those around him had been hit. You had to go on the air in those circumstances. But then we said the president had not been hit. That proved to be wrong. What about that? The answer is that the information came from the White House. We did not invent it. There was the announcement that James Brady, the White House press secretary, had died. Again, the first word came from somebody at the White House. We had no choice but to carry it. I remember apologizing on the air for this mistake, especially to any of Brady's friends or relatives who might have heard it. Now, what about the report on NBC, not on the other networks, that Mr. Reagan was undergoing open heart surgery? The reporter involved apparently heard that the president's chest had been opened to permit surgery and somehow turned that into open heart surgery. In short, a mistake. Now, what about some of the things I said? Was I not engaging in comment rather than straight reporting? The answer is yes, at times I was. I said, for example, that if somebody at the White House did not take charge, rumors and misinformation were likely to float around and make matters worse. Why did I say this? Because it's part of your job to put a story into perspective, to offer some sense of its significance and of what its consequences may be. Permit me to offer one more example of the sort of decisions that have to be made. 1992 was a presidential election year. You were in charge of a news operation with finite resources, budget, personnel, space and print, time on the air. Especially at the beginning of the primary process, how seriously should you have taken Pat Buchanan? If you gave him extensive coverage, were you helping his campaign? If you didn't, were you unfairly holding him back and depriving people of information they should have? Also, do you begin speculating now on how well Buchanan will do in '96? If you do, are you promoting his candidacy? Somebody has to make these decisions. Those who make them are not heroes who deserve the tearful thanks of a grateful nation. They're doing a job for which they're paid. That is, nevertheless, what the business is about. The idea that there is a conspiracy of some kind in the press, usually a liberal conspiracy, distracts us from reality. Now, I said that those who make these decisions are not heroes. Still, heroic work is done, covering earthquakes, famine, wars, terrorism, insurrections. To be less dramatic, cover drugs and crime in this country's inner cities. Try to master the implications of the international debt problem and the condition of the United States banking system. Try to follow the budget process in Washington, which is almost unfathomable. Half the job lies in writing these stories in a way that people will want to read. Journalists have to decide all the time how heavy they want their copy to be. I think the key lies here. It's easy to state general principles. It's easy to talk about the noble undertaking of journalism. The real questions are, how good are we? How competent are we? And above all, is there a demand in the United States for first-class popular journalism? Because without that demand, first-class popular journalism will not exist. Thank you very much. Having said thank you, I would like to add just a few words, some general observations about news and about politics. There's a good deal of worry in this country about the level on which politics is conducted, and there is, as there should be, worry about the level of the news business. In politics, attempts are made to reduce the influence of big money through limits on spending. The idea of term limits for legislators is catching on. Some people believe that having a single 6-year term for presidents would help. Underlying all of this is a public attitude to Congress and to politics generally that is one of disappointment and disillusionment, bordering on contempt. How to explain that attitude? Well, there were many contributing factors. One of them, the Camelot foolishness during John Kennedy's presidency. When details of his escapades began coming out soon after his death, the American people had reason to feel that they'd been deceived and that the press had been party to the deception. Then there were the revelations about Lyndon Johnson and his television station and how he came to be so rich. There was Watergate, there was Spiro Agnew, Betty Ford's drug addiction, Nancy Reagan's astrologer, the savings and loan disaster, the annual charade in Washington about cutting the budget deficit, an endless succession of scandals at all levels of government, the costly failures in the field of nuclear power, the transformation of the United States from a creditor nation to a debtor nation. There was Vietnam, and all it did to bring about anti-establishment attitudes and a change in public manners. And there was the change in public manners itself, which made acceptable a degree of candor about personal matters that had been unknown before. Politics and government get endless and extensive coverage, yet most Americans don't even bother to vote. They believe that it makes no difference to them who wins or loses, and that they cannot affect the outcome anyway. In the great underclass, where illiteracy and semi-literacy are prevalent, there must be many who are not even aware that politics exists. This situation is not helped by our campaigns, which are much too long, overblown, expensive, dominated by advertising, public relations, and polling, with politicians employing handlers and image makers and saying what they want to say by ignoring questions put to them and answering questions that have not been asked. News organizations fit in with all of that, giving far too much time and space to the same speeches and sound bites repeated over and over again. News judgment disappears after a while. You have your people out with the candidates, which means you have an investment in the campaign story, so you run it and run it and run it. Now, there are other reasons for the disillusionment with and alienation from politics. One is that our country is so big, so complex, and so varied with so many regional interests that at best it will be hard to govern. An example, the foreign competition that helped to kill so much industry in the Northeast was good for some parts of the Pacific Northwest, where foreign goods poured into the harbors and generated business. Another reason is that party discipline is a mere shadow of what it used to be, while at the same time, because of post-Watergate reforms, power is more widely distributed in Congress and legislative procedures have become more and more tortuous. So it's much harder to know where responsibility lies. Perhaps nobody would want to go back to the days of congressional bosses, but in those days it was possible to know who was doing what. One more reason, Capitol Hill is virtually a small city. Every member of Congress has a sizable staff. The natural urge among staffers is to do something, make a difference. How do you make a difference? By getting something for your district or by being responsible for a law. Congress is the legislative branch, so it legislates. It legislates far too much. I have long believed that Congress and state legislatures should devote some sessions not to passing new laws, but to repealing old ones. The computer weighs in here. The computer and its handmaidens pour out mountains of data. This makes members still more dependent on their staffs and increases the inclination to legislate because all of that, quote, information appears to confer authority on those who handle it. I believe that the country would be better off if some proportion were returned to our political campaigns, also if the standards of our journalism were generally higher. But if any of this did come about, it would be the result of changes in our society. It could not cause changes in that society. One reason is that the United States expects so much in the way of entertainment and drama and excitement. Another is that the kind of politics we have and the kind of news we have are determined to a considerable degree by developments outside politics and outside news. I mean, for example, education or its absence, and developments in computer and other technology, and developments in the techniques of marketing and public relations and advertising. On that last point, the money spent on political advertising on television in 1988 came to $227 million. That was up 48% on 1984. In 1992, candidates for the House and Senate alone spent $678 million on their campaigns, much of it on television. By the way, a study has shown that in television reporting on political campaigns, the average soundbite over a 10-year period shrank from 45 seconds to 9 seconds. In 1992, CBS announced that its sound bites would be at least 30 seconds long. It had to give that up quickly. Another study at the University of North Carolina showed that 25 years ago, 3/4 of the population read a newspaper every day. That's now down to about half the population, and most of the papers they read are far from what they used to be. Television is instrumental in this, of course, as newspapers suffer from falling circulations. So the American Society of Newspaper Editors commissioned a survey. One thing it found was that many young Americans do not read well enough to understand papers and so do not buy them. The committee that did the survey recommended changing writing styles, making stories catchier, written more from the reader's point of view, and being careful not to assume that readers know more than they do. Well, where does this leave us? It is not logical to expect to have a level of political life generally that is much higher than the broad level of popular culture in the country. It will happen from time to time, but it cannot be counted on, and it cannot be artificially induced. This applies also to the news business. The remedy lies in more independent reporting in general, greater skepticism on the part of the public, and in an unremitting puncturing of the overblown. Somehow the level of education and the degree of political sophistication must be raised, and people will have to vote. That should not be too much to ask. We must, in other words, recognize that the amount and quality of the information the American people receive is important. It is an important matter to be treated seriously, not lugubriously, not without humor, but seriously. Thank you again. If there are some questions or statements, pronouncements, objections. Well, actually, I planted the question because it had to do with my first two books. The first book actually was called Strictly Speaking. The second was A Civil Tongue. And the questioner asked what I thought had happened to American English generally since that time, and in particular what had happened to the level of political discourse. I think in general that there is much less pomposity and much less obscure language now in politics and in business, among other places, because of the amount of ridicule that has been directed at language of that kind. So we're seeing less deliberately obscure language and less pompous language, self-important language. On the other hand, there has certainly been no raising of the general level of discourse in the United States, and there is no reason to believe that the English that is generally used is superior to what had been used at the time I wrote the books in the 1970s. If anything, things probably have become worse. One reason they've become worse is that people who came through the educational system in the 60s and 70s are now in positions of some authority, and they came through a period when it was thought to be necessary to show your sincerity by saying you know at least 4 times a sentence. And also the view took hold that it didn't make any difference whether what you said was, quote, correct, provided that what you were saying was understood. And there was also the view that people who thought it worthwhile to write and speak well were snobs, who could be associated with all the dreadful things that these people saw happening in the country. So it's going to take us some time to get over this, but as the educational system improves and the standards are raised, and indeed they are being raised in many parts of the country, we should see a gradual improvement. But it will be gradual at best. It will not be countrywide. And unfortunately, as I was saying, we are seeing a lower level of writing in newspapers, and we're getting the same thing on radio and television. So I think there has not been any raising of the level of English generally, but I think there has been a welcome reduction in pompous language, jargon. There is a complication about which I know very little, but of which I am aware, and that is that we are in, not we, because I have nothing to do with it, but we as a people are in the process, we as a country are in the process of creating almost a separate language. This is the language of computers and the language of related electronic equipment, the language of the manuals that instruct people in operating these things, and that can be a language that will be very, very difficult to understand and will be known, comprehended only by those who have been initiated into the society, into that portion of society. So that means that we may well have an even greater division than we have now between those who, let's say, are educated and those who are not educated to the same degree or in the same field. Is there a down here?
It troubles me that the political campaigns require such a great deal of money, and the major portion of that money goes to the paying for television time. I'd like to know why it isn't possible to require television stations to permit a certain limited number of speeches by candidates with no charge made, and prevent them from taking any further advertising. Now, I realize that would be bad for television stations, economic standpoint, but don't you think that would be a better system?
Questioner said that he was troubled by the amount of money that goes into political campaigns for television or on television, and he wondered whether it would be possible to require television stations, and for that matter, I suppose radio stations, to provide time free, or as it has now become popular to say, for no reason I understand, for free, and to provide the time free, to require them to do that. Wouldn't that be a good idea? I think there's a general sentiment that that would be a good idea, and in fact, something like that was tried in the state of Florida some years ago and was held to be unconstitutional. So as with so many things in this country, so many issues, There is the matter of whether stations can be constitutionally required to do that. Now, even if they cannot be constitutionally required to do that, it may be that if they were aware of a sufficient surge of public opinion on this, they would do so. But certainly the cost of getting into politics nowadays is prohibitive for the vast majority of people, and this is clearly a problem that we have to tackle. Our attempts are made to limit the amount of money spent. Attempts are made to, as we all know, to limit the number of years incumbents can serve. I think the country is aware of the problem, but it's a very difficult one to solve, particularly because it is not out of keeping with American life generally. And but as with so many other things, if public opinion becomes strong enough on the matter, presumably something will be done. Sir.
You have a whole litany of topics of news judgment and things to be covered. Early on, you touched on the issue of the Gulf War coverage. Basically sanitized and probably censored. Do you feel that the media executives should have tried to boycott and force the government to allow the media to present the full story?
Questioner said that I had mentioned coverage of the Persian Gulf War in '91, and he said that the coverage had been sanitized, it had been controlled, and should news executives have boycotted this story until they were permitted to cover it independently. As a matter of fact, you may be happy to hear I have a section in this lecture which I did not give about the Persian Gulf War. And indeed, after the war, 17 of the leading news organizations in the United States filed a complaint with the Pentagon about the restrictions on coverage that were imposed. But, and I'm not saying that they were wrong, they were there, I wasn't, but there are certain elements that have to be taken into account. One is, of course, in a direct answer to your question, you cannot decline to cover a story of that kind. I mean, people generally would be outraged, with thousands upon thousands of Americans risking their lives, some of them losing their lives, with the country's reputation at stake, with tremendous acts of war being conducted in the name of the country. You could not boycott it. There is another complication. Technology so affects not only the way that we cover the news, it affects the way wars are conducted. And you cannot cover a war in the way that you did years ago. And if aircraft are flying over a battle area and firing missiles, how are you going to get any pictures of the missiles landing unless the military are taking them? There's nobody else to do it. Now, this may lead to your being misled, perhaps, about how effective this is, or how effective the missiles were, and indeed that did happen. But given the nature of the fighting, given the nature of the terrain, given the number of reporters and camera crews who were there, the number of languages being used by the various journalists who were there was something like 36, as I recall. It was clearly a tremendously difficult problem. Now, American news organizations, and not only American news organizations, have felt ever since Vietnam a degree of suspicion about what they're told and about what they're permitted to do. And that is understandable, but the possibility that reporters and camera crews can go out on their own is shrinking as the manner in which wars are fought changes. And as I say, this is also affected very much by the terrain, or indeed whether you're on land at all. So it's a terribly, terribly difficult problem. And there's another element to it, which I should mention, which is that one result of Vietnam was that the military disliked a great deal of the reporting that was done. Some of it was among the best reporting that was done in that part of the world, and that led them to impose certain restrictions on news people that had not been imposed before. So Vietnam continues to affect the way the military deal with the press, and therefore the way the press, or those of us in the news, react to it. But there's very little you can do in a situation like the Persian Gulf. Ma'am?
Mr. Newman, I can see why everyone respects you so much. Thank you for coming. I wanted to mention I heard you on WOR this morning with Joe Hamburg, and that's why I'm here tonight. And you mentioned that the music, or so-called music, that you played today, that you didn't feel it was really completely called music. You didn't get to really expound on that. I really agreed with you and wanted to hear more. Can you elaborate a little more on the music?
The questioner said that she had heard me this morning being interviewed on WOR by Joan Hamburg, and that when I was speaking about level of news, and still more, I think, the level of English, as I recall, I said that what has happened to American popular music is in keeping. Perhaps I didn't say this in that interview, but it was the point I would have liked to get to if I'd had the time, that what has happened to popular music in the United States is in keeping with what has happened to American English. That what now passes for music, popular music, is so reminiscent of a good deal of the conversation you hear when you hear the same words, usually obscene words, used over and over and over and over again. There's no variety, there's no originality, there's no imagination. There is no attempt to make what is being said appropriate to the circumstances in which it is being said. And our music now, so-called, fits in with this because where language is involved, where language is concerned, it is there to be enjoyed. There's tremendous pleasure that can be had from using the language well and using it in a manner that is appropriate to the circumstances in which you or I will find ourselves, and you and I will find ourselves. So there are times when you want to use poetic language, when you want to use sarcastic language, when you want to make a joke, when you want to be tremendously serious, when you want to be serene, when you want to be respectful, and so on and so on. The language should accord with the circumstances. Music should do the same, but of course it doesn't. The popular music we hear now is, in my view, is simply noise. It's a lot of howling and a lot of shouting and a lot of banging. And the sad part of it, as with language, is that the almost inconceivable treasury of music of all kinds that is there to be enjoyed is simply unknown to the great majority of young people, and probably not only young people, in this country. They don't know the glorious pleasure to be had, that is to be had from, well, I won't go on, but I do remember, and I won't list all the great composers, but I do remember saying this morning that many young people these days think that what the music they hear is passionate, sexy, uninhibited. But if they would listen to the love duet in Othello, if they would listen to the love duet in the first act of Madame Butterfly, if they would listen to the opening pages, the orchestra in the Rosenkavalier, and so on, and one could think of thousands of examples, they would know what real passion is in music and not simply this manufactured stuff. So as I was saying, I think what has happened to popular music, given the change from the great days of the Gershwins and Irving Berlin and Vincent Youmans and so many more, Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and on and on and on. The same thing, as I say, has happened to popular music that unfortunately has happened to American English. I'm glad I planted that question. Ma'am?
One of the things that I miss very much is the fact that the newspapers no longer seem to do investigative reporting. There was a time when you felt that they were there uncovering many of the things that should be uncovered. And now they're just slid over instead. And I wonder if there's a reason for that major change.
Questioner said that one thing that troubles her is that newspapers seem no longer to be doing investigative reporting. There was a time when they did it. But now I think you used the term, you said they slid over things. After Watergate, maybe this is somehow will shed some light on it, I'm not sure. After Watergate, there was a tremendous outburst of investigative reporting, brought about indeed by Watergate itself and the amazing work that Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein did at that time. And this led every news organization, every self-respecting news organization, to set up an investigative unit if it didn't already have one. But as with so many things in news, there are fashions. And it may be that the fashion in investigative reporting faded as editors and publishers discovered that that kind of reporting wasn't paying off the way it did. I'm guessing at this. I have to tell you it's a subject I haven't thought about, and I think it's very interesting that you raised it. It's well worth thinking about. But that we certainly we reached a peak in investigative reporting after Watergate. So perhaps a reaction against that was unavoidable, and conceivably it will come back. One element in this, though, I think, is something I referred to before, which is the assumption or the belief that people do not want to read long stories. They don't want to read difficult stories. They don't want to read involved accounts, things that are not easy to follow. And so the style of writing has noticeably changed. And that may have something to do with it as well, but it's a very interesting point. Thank you for raising it. Over there.
Could you comment on the Guatemala CIA story now and how far you think this is going to go?
Would I comment on the Guatemala CIA story and how far I think it's going to go? I do not have an opinion that I think is worth having, certainly not worth listening to anyway, on this matter. But this, in a way, raises a question related to the question we had before. Why did this go on for so long without its being reported? And one reason is that there has been a disinclination in the United States to do any reporting about Latin America. That has been the case for decades, many decades. We don't really look very much at Latin America. But it wasn't only Guatemala, it was Nicaragua, Panama, among other places. And clearly this is an area in which the press, news people generally did not do what they should have done, or perhaps I should say did not do what we should have done. And there is perhaps a disinclination on the part of some people in the business to appear to be anti-United States. One is you can become uncomfortable opposing United States policy and being critical of American policy, so not everybody wants to get into that. But this is obviously one area in which the press, news people, fell short, and there were others. It's one reason I speak about the news business. I don't speak about the media. We don't always do what we ought to be doing. Another example was the savings and loan scandal in this country, which was a story that simply was not properly covered for a very, very long time. So there are failures in our business. Whether that's an adequate explanation, I don't know, but the point here is that there are times when we do fall short, decidedly. Yeah.
Feel that there's an inordinate amount of time in a half-hour period of television news broadcast given to the number of local fires and local shootings that have taken place?
Do I feel that there's an inordinate amount of time given on local news programs to the fires and the shootings that have taken place? Well, as I was suggesting, in television, with the emphasis on the picture or on the pictures, there's always an attempt to get something dramatic on the screen. So you do get tremendous amount of attention paid to fires and to shootings, among other things, because they very often will yield dramatic pictures. On the other hand, with respect to the shootings, we do now have in the United States, and have had for some time, an extraordinary number of people being killed, people being murdered. We have a tremendous amount of crime. This is one of the great issues facing the nation. And if you did not report on this, you would not be telling the people of a particular city what was happening in their city, perhaps in their very area, their neighborhood. And you would not be acquainting them with the reality of life in the United States today. Is it perhaps overdone? Maybe somebody else may have an opinion on that. But it's a very difficult question, because so much of our municipal news is about things that are wrong, and they tend to dominate our lives. I mean, people here, I dare say, do not go out on the street in quite the same spirit that they did for years ago. Most of us very careful now about what we do, what we carry, and that kind of thing, even about how we dress sometimes. So to some extent, what we're seeing on television reflects what is happening in the cities. It may be that at times it's reported with a bit too much gusto, but one can get very tired of it, but if you get tired of it, you're getting tired of life as it is. So it's a hell of a problem for news people. Sir.
Some people took exception to the New York Times adding style sections, fashion sections, what they call dumbing down of the press. Do you feel there's a place for that, like a newspaper such as the Times? Getting overflow.
Questioner said that some people had objected to the addition of a style section and similar sections to the New York Times, and they regarded that as a dumbing down of the Times. Do I think that there's a place for that on a paper like the Times? Well, this is, I think, an excellent example of the fact, a demonstration of the fact, I should say, that news is a business, and if the Times wants to keep its circulation up, which means not merely keeping its circulation up, but keeping its advertising rates up, it does this kind of thing. And newspapers have to decide all the time how serious they want to be. I was saying earlier, people in the news business have to decide all the time how heavy they want their copy to be, how immediately comprehensible they want to make it, how catchy they want to make it, how many photographs you want to use, a tremendous amount of emphasis on the makeup of a page of newspapers. So when that is done, it's done out of business considerations, undoubtedly, and be easy to say to a newspaper, well, you shouldn't be running that kind of thing. But the newspaper people might reply, well, if we didn't run it, we wouldn't have a newspaper. So they've cut down the magazine articles. Well, as you know, there are organizations that exist to study newspaper readers, magazine readers, television watchers, radio listeners, and analyzing them down to the last decimal point. And all of this kind of thing probably is based on investigations and attempts to determine where the future of the paper lies, what it has to do to stay alive, what it has to do to be able to afford to have all those bureaus overseas that it has, and so on. News is a business. Ma'am?
What do you think about the sale of public broadcasting stations?
What do I think about the sale of public broadcasting stations? Forgive me, I honestly don't have an opinion on that. I don't have any particular knowledge. If there's somebody else here who does, perhaps we could have. What do you think about it? Do you have an opinion? Yes.
Well, my opinion as a non-professional is that the public broadcasting sector provides us with longer sound bites, very often less opinionated news, and I think that's a plus.
And you think that these stations should not be sold, then?
Not sold for commercial use.
Not sold for commercial reasons.
And I think it's short-sighted if a city is going to raise, a few $1 million at the time of the sale, when the long vision is that some commercial venture is going to raise billions in the end.
Thank you. I think you, no?
I was going to ask you, what percentage of the news is sort of controlled by the government or by the media? When you were talking before about the election results and how they're falsely reported, what goes on there exactly?
You say election results falsely reported?
Well, you said that they were overrated or they were, did you say that?
I was speaking. You're asking to what degree does the government control what is put out in political stories? No, I was talking about exaggeration of interpretation of the results to try to make the story more arresting, to make it more dramatic, to sum it up in a sentence or two. Well, to what degree do governments control this? Government spokespeople will often come forward and try to interpret the results, but nobody in the news business is obliged to accept the interpretation. And indeed, if you get an interpretation from somebody in the government, you may well put on somebody else who has an opposing view or a different interpretation. The government controls news to the extent that it so often is putting out the information that we need. So much of, let's say, President Clinton has a meeting with Boris Yeltsin. Well, no news people are going to be present at that meeting, so you have to rely, at least in the first instance, on what the government spokesman tell you about what was said. Then after that, if you can, you poke around and try to talk to other people who were there and perhaps get their views of what happened. But there are so many things, and the Persian Gulf War was an example of it, where you're obliged to rely, at least in the first instance, on what the government gives you. So, but there is a tremendous skepticism, as you know, among news people, and as there ought to be, and indeed there ought to be skepticism on the part of the public as well. Sir?
Would you like to discuss the contract with America?
Would I like to discuss the contract with America? I will discuss it from this point of view, if I may. It was a brilliant idea because it's a catchy phrase. It's a 3-word phrase that can be used over and over and over again, and it gives the Republicans in the Congress, certainly in the House, a readily recognizable hook, and there's nothing, and a hook that we can use, and there's nothing that news people like better than a hook, or like more than a hook on which to hang your story. So the contract with America gives us a hook day after day after day. It's and it also suggests, or it implies, that the Democrats do not have a contract with America. So it was a great idea. On the other hand, inevitably, judgment will be made about the degree to which the contract was carried out, and that's what we're seeing every day. But if the Republicans can get most of it through, and I think it will have been a remarkably ingenious idea. One more? Back, I can't see in the balcony, but please go ahead.
You mentioned lack of voter turnout and the poor showing that the people make. My opinion is that the reason there's such a poor showing is because our politicians in Congress are only interested in power, greed, and the next election.
Did everybody hear that? No comment. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.